What are some declassified government documents that are surprisingly terrifying? This one does get more intense, guys, as it goes on, so please be aware of that. This isn't really a classified document, but at one point the US government was telling people to build your own bomb shelter to protect your family, and it showed how to dig an 8-foot by 4-foot by 10-foot hole in your backyard, and if there is a nuclear threat, to get your family and go in there and cover it with a door. So obviously that wouldn't really protect anyone in the case of a nuclear attack. Later it came out that the purpose of telling families to do that was so that if there was a nuclear attack on American soil, they wouldn't have to bury as many bodies because the families dug their own graves. So yeah, not classified, but along the same disturbing stuff the US government did. I have a copy of this pamphlet. A lot of the designs seemed really stupid. The door with 2 kiddie pools filled with sand in it. One in particular, though in its defense that one was supposed to be in your basement. Devil Eyes. The plan after 9/11 to make figurines that looked like Osama bin Laden and give them to kids in South Asia. After it's left in the sun for a certain amount of time, its face would peel off to reveal a demon-like visage with red skin, green eyes and black markings. Basically, a demon. The object was to scare kids and their parents so bin Laden and Al-Qaeda would lose support. You should watch The Holy Mountain. In it, they talk about knowing they will have to go to war with the country in 15 years. They make comic books and toys with a villain that looks like that other race. They also make ipecac type medicine, the same colour as the skin of that race. All sorts of things to prepare kids to hate a particular race by the time they are of military age and the war is fought. When the Space Shuttle Challenger was destroyed, it was reported that all 7 astronauts were killed instantly. It was revealed decades later that some, if not all of the astronauts survived the initial explosion, as a cockpit cabin had enough protection to not be breached. For 2 minutes and 45 seconds they were awake and aware as they plummeted towards the Atlantic Ocean. Understandably, NASA knew that the news of their terrifying death would have crippled the space program even more than it already was. We looked at this in flight school and pretty much there's evidence to support that the crew was still running their procedures even after it was obvious shit hit the fan. They didn't die accepting their fate, they died astronaut. That's something to be admired in my opinion. Read the book 1 Second After. It's about what happens after an EMP attack on the US. It's based on actual government studies and estimates. It is terrifying. The Nixon administration had a speech prepared for if the moon landing had failed, and it's chilling. You can read it here. Really is chilling. Imagine if they landed on the moon and were unable to lift off again, just having to sit there and stare at Earth as they die. Yikes. Imagine looking up at the moon today and knowing there are 2 bodies up there staring at 2 corpses every night. There are over 50 mishaps with nuclear weapons by the US Air Force in the 1950s alone. Lol, we had a plane arrive in Barksdale carrying a live nuke and nobody knew how it got on the plane. Oh, Air Force. Oh, I remember when that happened, not long after I joined. It wasn't just 1 nuke, but 6 of them. The Air Force literally was missing 6 nukes and had no idea. Not long after that, they accidentally shipped ICBM parts to Taiwan. My previous answer to another post. Not sure if this has been mentioned or not. I'm not scrolling through a million replies. The site is run by a guy named John Greenwald. Started putting in Freedom of Information Act requests when he was 15 and never stopped. Currently has what is arguably the largest privately owned collection of declassified information from the US government anywhere, and the entire archive is accessible for free. Not a direct answer to your question, but anything you want to know about the stuff that the US government was up to can be found buried in there, and he's taken the time to sort some of the more interesting stuff out to make browsing easier. Cheers. His Black Vault podcast is always a good listen, even if you don't buy into the UFO stuff. He doesn't hesitate to point out the bullshit from anyone, whether they are believers in this stuff or not, and gives a lot of time to skeptics to put their side of the argument and treats everyone with respect. Operation Midnight Climax. The government hired sex workers to dose Johns with LSD for research purposes, so to speak. Threat level midnight. Jump to the right and shake a hand. Jump to the left and you shake their hand. Meet new friends, tie some yarn. That's how you do the scarn. Here's one from the Brits and the Aussies in the 50s. Nuclear tests in Marilanga. Oh yeah, some Aboriginals live nearby. The government were going to nuke Scotland for a while, I think. Then they realised that was a stupid idea, as Scotland is a pretty small place, relatively speaking, and nuked Australia instead. I'm kind of surprised they didn't do as the Americans did and nuke a territory in the Pacific. The Pitcairn Islands are still British, and they didn't care about protecting endangered species then. Australia was independent in the 1950s. I can't imagine the High Commissioner asking if we could nuke part of Australia. Boeing X-37B unmanned space shuttle. It just spent 720 days in space doing God knows what. Testing stuff, and maybe taking pictures like the one Trump tweeted of the Iranian space launch site. Apparently the United States Air Force has disclosed that it's testing a heat pipe assembly, but I'm sure there's other stuff we're not allowed to know about. In East Germany, a committed freedom fighter and her husband had dealt with having her home raided while she was away, being arrested on the way to protests and all sorts of state-sponsored harassment. After the wall fell, she was able to read the documents the Stasi had kept on her and found out her own husband was an undercover agent and has written many reports on her activities with a bloodless banality. British Metropolitan Police Services have done exactly the same on ecological protesters from organisations like Greenpeace. There was literally a case a few years back, like 5 years ago, an undercover cop, I believe, married and even had kids with a protester he was investigating the whole way through. And then he didn't have to pay child support because he was on the job, and our government said they weren't liable either. F***ing joke. Canadian here, the Somali affair. Not sure if it was ever classified, but definitely a horrific scandal. A now disbanded division of the Canadian military torturing a kid to death in the 90s and taking hero pics with him while doing it. I think it's important to remember when your country does something shitty, it's not always the bad guys who can be f***ing evil. We have something similar in Belgium. Belgian soldiers tortured kids in Somalia in 1993. Operation Northwoods, a plan for a false flag operation that came from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Department of Defense in 1962 and given to JFK, who turned it down. The plan called for the CIA to commit terrorist actions against US civilians across the United States and frame Cuba, allowing us the right to invade and depose Castro and the communist government there. It was declassified and can only be found at the JFK Library. Terrifying that no one knows or seems to care that this was suggested by our government to the president. My high school English teacher mandated that I read this. I didn't understand it at the time, but he was responding to my question I posed him. As an airborne vet, why do you seem so jaded in regards to US history and politics? Still one of my favourite teachers to this day. He and I were able to go into a lot of other lost things the US has done. CIA invested millions in trying to make cat spies. $20 million to be precise. I don't know, the way my friend's cat is staring at me right now, maybe they succeeded. Don't worry, they were only able to successfully make one working spy cat, and it got run over by a truck shortly after deployment. The project was called Acoustic Kitty. Project Sunshine, where the US government bought remains of dead infants to test for radiation. When they took limbs from them, the parents were never told. One mother wasn't allowed to dress her daughter for her funeral because doctors had removed her legs and didn't want her to find out. Is anyone else ridiculously disturbed that they named the project Project Sunshine? What the f***? When they performed a lobotomy on Rosemary Kennedy due to her being intellectually disabled, at 23 years of age, her father arranged a prefrontal lobotomy. At the time, the procedure had only been done about 100 times in the US. It failed, leaving her unable to speak intelligibly and incapacitated. She was conscious during the operation. They say that the neurosurgeons, or whatever they're called, asked the patient to count from 10 to know when they should stop cutting down. I've heard that they stopped when her speech was incoherent. Saddest thing is that she had to endure it for 64 years. All that because her family couldn't risk any political embarrassment. I notice this is more disturbing than terrifying, but I think it fits. I remember something about a heart attack gun I read some time ago. Basically a poison gun that once shot is untraceable in the victim's body and leaves no mark on their body. Sorry if it sounds really vague. I think that's enough detail for me. I don't think it's classified, but Project Thor, using a satellite bomber to bomb a city. Imagine a missile or a bomb coming from space, and before you know it, your city is destroyed by a falling missile bomb. It was called Rods from God. Basically, it would have used kinetic energy, no explosives. It would have used a series of 2,000-pound tungsten rods to destroy and vaporize without the radiation of a nuclear bomb. It was only avoided because we signed treaties with the Russians not to weaponize space. As a part of the army and CIA's experiments into mind control, they put electrodes into the pleasure centers of dogs' brains. Initially, they wanted hundreds of dogs. They only actually got 10, and of those, only a few were implanted. The ones which would be remote controlled by zapping them and essentially give them a dose of dopamine when they were facing the right direction. The controllers would stop the dope zap when they wanted the dogs to stop, and then the dogs would reorient themselves until they were facing the correct direction. This meant when the controllers weren't present, the dogs who had been implanted would continually spin in circles, even in their cages, always looking for the direction that gave them their next hit. The program ran out of funding in the mid-60s, and the dogs were destroyed. Oh, okay. Well, that's a dark one to end the video on. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that as much as you could. Make sure you subscribe if you are new here, and I'll see all of you guys in the next video.